I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. Omicron, the new variant described to have a constellation of mutations, has the world on its knees. But is that the appropriate response? We'll be putting that question to one of India's foremost scientists. Let's take you through what we know thus far. There is global panic instead of pragmatism over the new COVID variant Omicron. Many of us forgetting that this is not the first, but the seventh variant since the pandemic first broke. India is among the countries to impose travel restrictions. Many of those travel restrictions, especially at the state level, are being called by critics as bizarre. We'll be looking more closely at those as the key question remains: how effective will the present lot of vaccines be against Omicron? 3 different vaccine manufacturers have had 3 different responses in the absence of clear data, which could take another 2 to 3 weeks to emerge. What do we know? What do we not know? And what should we be doing? We'll be placing those questions to Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who has been a guiding light through these 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, not just for India, but for much of the world, who listens very, very carefully to what she says. Welcome, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, to our program. It's a pleasure having you on. I must start by asking you how you make sense of the fact that 3 vaccine manufacturers have 3 completely different things on how effective their vaccines are against Omicron. What do you make of these 3 contradictory comments?
I think the point is that all of the vaccine manufacturers at the moment have no data. This was a virus where the sequence was available last week, and we have only just begun to get some epidemiological information about this particular variant. Now, if we look at what needs to be done for them to generate data, they can approach it, as all of them have done, by looking at where the mutations are and trying to predict in silico what the effects of their vaccine might possibly be. Are the mutations in places where they think their vaccine-induced antibodies actually bind? And based on that, you can say that, if you mainly induce antibodies to the receptor binding domain or to the spike protein, then how many of those mutations are in places where antibodies bind? So this is an in silico analysis based on which they are producing data. Now, if you really want lab-based data, you have to have either a pseudovirus or you have to have the virus itself, and you have to look for neutralizing antibodies. Those are the only ones that are going to provide us with clues about how well vaccines might work. Since pseudoviruses are just being generated, the virus is just being grown in culture, it is much too early to have the assays up and running. So a couple of weeks before we have lab data, and possibly about the same time or a little longer until we have clinical information.
So would it be fair to say that when the Moderna CEO gives a very, very, in fact, I thought irresponsible statement suggesting that his vaccines would be less effective, because it just furthers the panic. And on the other hand, you have, those who've been working on the AstraZeneca vaccine at Oxford, you have the BioNTech vaccine saying completely opposite things. You're saying none of them. Those who are saying the vaccines will hold and those who are saying the vaccines won't hold, none of them actually have the grounds to make any of those comments right now.
I mentioned they're basing this essentially on computer-generated information, modeling and computer studies, which can be helpful, but really don't tell you about how the variant and antibodies against the vaccine are going to perform in real life.
Now, there are on the number of mutations on the spike protein, which is what their vaccines are designed to target. The South African scientists who first outed this variant to the world have described it to be a constellation of mutations. Could you explain what it means to spot mutations on a variant and why per se that would worry scientists?
So mutations happen all the time. And some mutations have no consequences. It's like, comparing American spelling and UK spelling. You still get the meaning whether you use one form of spelling or the other. So those mutations are inconsequential mutations. And then you have mutations which actually change how the virus behaves. And those are the ones that we really need to worry about. And this is what people are looking at now. Are these consequential mutations or not? Just the fact that this particular virus has so many mutations compared to what we saw in alpha and delta is worrying. The fact that they are clustered in the receptor binding domain, in the spike, does worry people, because we need to try and understand exactly what they mean for the behavior of the virus. And at the moment, the information we have seems to show that this virus is more transmissible. Now, the virus can be transmissible in a number of ways. It can be more transmissible because it binds better to the receptor. It can be more transmissible because it multiplies at a higher level and therefore viral loads are higher. So we need to understand what all these mutations are doing to change virus behavior, to make it more transmissible, and then we'll have to look at whether they also result in an increased severity of disease and variation in the performance of vaccines.
So you're saying the number of mutations could suggest that it is easier for this virus to spread. I'm just translating this right now into layperson language, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this virus, for example, will be more lethal than the Delta or more virulent, maybe that's the more accurate word, that we saw, for instance, in the second surge in India.
That's correct. So with Delta, we had similar worries, and we had the early results from Delta being evaluated in the lab, where people predicted that it would work a lot less well. Vaccines would work a lot less well than against Delta. We actually found that the effect of the variant was less profound than had been shown in the lab studies.
So hang on, you're saying lab studies had shown that the vaccines would not be so effective against Delta, and on ground, that's not what happened.
On ground, they were somewhat less effective against Delta, but they were effective. And it's likely that we might see the same thing again with Omicron.
So that is what I really want to talk about. You know, a lot of times we hear these days, since the sort of calling out of Omicron, this phrase vaccine escape. But isn't it important to underline that when we talk about variants that may resist vaccines, we're not saying, oh, the vaccine is zero against Omicron. We're saying if the vaccine gave you 4 points out of 10 against Alpha and 5 against Delta, and I'm just hypothesizing here and picking up random numbers, then Omicron might get 3.45. And so maybe the vaccines have to be bettered if needed, but it doesn't mean zero, which is what people are taking it to mean. And the Moderna CEO statement in particular is actually going to strengthen the anti-vaxxers instead of those who are saying, go out and get your jab.
Well, the bottom line is go out and get your jab, because it is very likely that your jab will give you some level of protection against every variant of SARS-CoV-2, including Omicron. We just don't know how much protection we will get. We will have this information soon. We may be able to do what we did against the beta variant, right? There was an effort to make a beta variant vaccine because beta actually had the greatest immune escape. But when people who had previously received Moderna and Pfizer were given the beta variant vaccine, and that was compared to a third jab of the older version, we found that actually even people who received a third jab of the older version broadened their immune response.
So but it's important. It's important to remember right now that there was a variant that also had a high immune escape. We're also wrapped up in Omicron. We forget we've been in this place before.
Exactly. And we also know that if you think about boosters, if you think about mixing and matching vaccines, we might have tools with the existing vaccines itself to improve performance. And we can make new vaccines quickly if we need to make them. It's not clear yet that we actually need to make new vaccines. It's not clear yet that the vaccines we have are not going to work.
I'm glad you've said that because I want to shift our focus now to the kind of travel restrictions we've seen globally, which South Africa in particular has protested, saying that they have been penalized for their transparency and for the very significant work done by their scientists. The other point that we now know is that there's a kind of racism, as it were, in this, because this virus is shown to have been actually first spotted in parts of Europe than in Africa, and yet the countries that have been penalized the most are the African countries. I will come to the Indian travel policy separately, but the global travel bans / restrictions, what do you make of those?
Well, I think when you have travel restrictions of any kind, it does slow the virus down just because fewer people are traveling. But what actually makes sense is that today we know that there are going to be lots of variants. This is not the last one, this is not the first one. Can we please get a sensible policy in place that tells us that if a new variant comes along, you have this kind of pre-travel testing and this kind of post-travel testing. This is what will be done if you test positive, 1 week of home quarantine. If you're willing to be tested on a daily basis and you continue to be negative, then why stop people from going about their functions? We know that no matter what testing we do, we will have some leakage of this virus because it's carried in asymptomatic people, and it's very likely in many more than the 20 odd countries that have reported it so far. So before we learn more about the variant and how it's behaving, it makes sense to try and slow it down. But we also need this to not be constantly doing new things each time a new variant is announced. We need a policy that is clear.
I have to say that I'm a critic of travel bans just because I believe, as you said, that this will not be the last variant, and the impact, as the WHO has also said, on lives and livelihood and the economy, the global economy, is enormous in so many different ways, from students to businesses to tourism. When you do impose these restrictions, and I'm wondering why we are not being able to urge governments, including our own, to mandate vaccines. The Kerala chief minister, for instance, has finally come up with a very interesting, stern policy saying those who actually do not cooperate anymore with COVID prevention measures will now have to submit weekly results of RT-PCR paid for themselves, and they will, I mean, there's a kind of sort of linkage to treatment here, saying no more free treatment with those who refuse to get vaccinated. And 12 crore Indians at last count had not shown up for their second jab. Is it time to mandate vaccines? Is it high time to mandate vaccines?
I don't believe in mandates because, for one reason or the other, forcing people to do things has some level of blowback. But I do believe in disincentives to not be vaccinated. Yeah. So if we think about things like, if you didn't get vaccinated, then you are not entitled to free treatment. I think that's a reasonable approach to have. And in fact, it's not a new approach. Yeah. This used to happen, where I'm located. We were told quite clearly, if you didn't get typhoid vaccines when you were students, then if you got typhoid, you wouldn't get free treatment. So I think these are approaches that can certainly be taken, that can ensure that we have a high level of uptake. And if after that people feel like they absolutely don't want to take vaccines, then it's up to schools and employers and everybody else to decide what they are willing to accept or not. So if schools say we are not having unvaccinated children, or employers say, well, if you want to work for us, you need to be doubly vaccinated, I think those are appropriate approaches to take.
I'm raising this in the context of the debate around what you might call the third shot or the booster dose, depending on your perspective. In India, the Indian Council for Medical Research, before Omicron, had ruled this out. But there are now questions about needing that third shot, especially with the emergence of this variant, at least for the elderly and the health workers at the front line. Do you think that India should be revisiting policy on third shots, especially because you are penalizing a section of the population willing and eager to take that third shot for a section of the population that is refusing to take their second shot?
So I think, my push is, can we see the data, please?
Okay.
So if we look at what is available to us, we have data until mid-September on deaths in vaccinated and unvaccinated individuals that seem to indicate that vaccines are continuing to work very well against at least protecting people by death, against death. Those data that are provided by the government are not broken up by age and are not broken up by vaccine. They do not cover hospitalizations. Now, the rest of the world made its decision on boosters based on data on hospitalizations by age. We do not have that data in our country. We are also not identical to the rest of the world, because at least half of our population got infected with the Delta variant and then got vaccinated. Yes. That's not the situation in the rest of the world. So for us to be able to look at our own data and make decisions based on our data is really, really important, not just for Omicron, but for everything that we do that is vaccination policy.
But can we get that data out fast enough and aggregate it and cut and splice it fast enough now, given this new variant? Or do you believe that you could take a decision, as countries outside India have done, everyone over 40 or everyone over 60, which is how we did our first vaccine rollout?
The simplest data that can give us answers is age, hospitalization, date that people tested positive, which vaccine they got, and on what dates. You can't tell me that that is impossible for an IT power like India to put together in a reasonable time frame. We've given, almost 1.2 billion doses of vaccine, and yet the effectiveness data that we have is in the thousands, tens of thousands, not even in lakhs. So I think that is a very odd situation for us to be in as scientists.
And you're saying without this data, making a policy on the third shot / booster shot would not make sense?
Well, it would not be an evidence-informed policy.
Okay. There's one more question that has arisen in this debate around booster shots, and that is whether the Covishield / AstraZeneca vaccines, which most of India has been administered with, compared to the mRNA vaccines, there's some debate that while the mRNA vaccines provided higher efficacy, they also depleted swifter as time went along. And by contrast, and this is what some scientists are arguing, the AstraZeneca / Covishield is behaving differently. Is there any basis to make this argument?
So there are data that have come out from the UK, particularly from Public Health in England, showing that there is waning of efficacy of the AstraZeneca vaccine as well as of the mRNA vaccines. The argument for the third dose, in fact, is to use the mRNA vaccines as far as possible, because that is giving much better protection, which has been seen in Israel and other countries as well. So the idea of using the vectored vaccines was to try and see whether you had better cell-mediated immune responses with AstraZeneca equivalent vaccines. And so far, the antibody data has been so predominant that the incremental effect of the cell-mediated immunity has not become clearly evident. One of the questions to me is, would it require a longer period of time? We jumped early to give boosters. Had we waited longer, would the signals have been clearer? They're certainly not clear at the moment.
Well, in India, we're not giving the boosters and we don't have the mRNA vaccines. So, what does that mean for us?
Which means we might have some science to contribute to the world if we can get our act together.
What about, I will come back to some Indian policies on Omicron, but what about the place of therapeutics? You see, much is different today than was in 2020 or even the first half of 2021. We just have a very, very closely contested approval for a pill for COVID by the FDA in the United States of America. But the jury is out. The results of this are not great. The vaccines are still seen to be more effective than the drugs. But what do we make of what we know about the therapeutic options available to fight COVID, and do they change with the variants?
So, therapeutic options are unlikely to change with the variants except for monoclonal antibodies. Because monoclonal antibodies are directed against the surface proteins of the virus, they may not function as well for variants. But when it comes to molnupiravir, to Paxlovid, which are the new antivirals that have been developed for and tested for SARS-CoV-2, those do work. Molnupiravir's final results are not as encouraging as their previous results, but it has now been FDA approved. One thing that's important to remember is that the molnupiravir trial was actually conducted in people who had risk factors for severe disease. So how will this play out if healthy people that acquire a SARS-CoV-2 infection take molnupiravir? We don't know yet. And we will need to start using the drug in order to get those answers. So I think it's good that we have the tools, but we'll need to wait and see how this plays out.
So I want to turn our focus back on Omicron and the Indian response. We've had two sort of responses. The centrally imposed new travel guidelines, which are at the moment, asking for RT-PCR tests from those coming from at-risk countries. And there's a whole bunch of at-risk countries. Basically, any country where an Omicron case has been found seems to have been classified as an at-risk country. Now, most of these countries are also asking for a RT-PCR before you go. Now, isn't this poor science and needless panic and needless expense? An RT-PCR at departure and RT-PCR at arrival, how does that make sense? Does it make sense?
Well, I think one thing to remember is that if you're incubating a virus, it can take between 2 and 14 days to manifest itself in most people. And in some people, it may take a shorter time or a longer time. So 2 to 14 is the broad incubation period of the virus. So testing multiple times during that incubation period might allow you to pick up positives. Now, what's the right interval is 2 days apart before you travel and after you travel, assuming it's a long flight. Is that right? Should it be 1 week apart, 5 days apart? I think you really need modeling studies to show you which is the best approach. The fact is that the more tests you have, the more likely you are to pick up a virus.
Well,
a
then
week
maybe
apart generally makes sense.
A week apart makes sense, okay. But maybe one way to go is what so many countries, for example, outside India have done, which is almost to treat the COVID test now as the pregnancy self-kit test used to be at once upon a time. You buy it over the counter, you take it home, you test yourself. You have to count somewhere on civic responsibility, and that people are going to be concerned if they test positive. The testing then has to be that easy. It can't be this serpentine line at point of departure, at point of destination, because we're going to shut the world down every time a variant comes otherwise.
So when you want to do more frequent testing, that's where rapid antigen tests really come into their own, where
Yeah.
you can swab yourself, you can do the test yourself and get your result quickly and move on. So it makes sense. If you're willing to do frequent rapid antigen tests, really RT-PCR, insisting on an RT-PCR doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think and I think maybe, the new kind of travel is going to have to look at some of these options. But look at Maharashtra. Maharashtra is asking for 3 RT-PCR tests for interstate within India travel, right? We've seemed to have gone back to 2020. This to me is to not have, and Maharashtra was one of the states that had good imaginative policies at the height of the pandemic. Isn't this overboard?
It's overboard.
It is. I'm glad you say that. Now, if you had to create a template for how we should be responding till we have more data on Omicron, one, let me ask you, when do you think would be enough time that we would say, okay, now we know?
I think we are going to have more data emerging over the next month. So if I made a policy, I would say this is a policy that is going to be reviewed based on data every week.
Yeah.
And at the end of a month, we will make a decision about what will or will not need to be done beyond this point. I think we will have a much clearer picture in that time.
And if in the meantime, what should we be doing and what should we not be doing? For instance, we have had in India among the largest school shutdowns in the world. Now you have Mumbai, for example, once again postponing the school reopening because of Omicron.
I think we should have opened schools a long time ago. There is absolutely no reason to delay school opening.
So what is finally, if I had to ask you on the spectrum of, worried to reasonably calm, because, as a scientist, that these variants are going to keep coming as long as there are infections. And there is a suggestion now increasingly in the scientific community that for countries that are looking for COVID to go away, that's not going to happen. The best you can hope for is to manage it, and to manage it like we manage other viruses. Are we at that stage? Are we underestimating the psychological threshold that people have crossed, that you can't, for example, ever impose a lockdown, I think, anywhere in the world anymore? Just as an example.
Well, I think there are going to be lockdowns that will be imposed in the world, but whether that is a rational decision or not is something that we can argue about. I'm very much on the non-lockdown side of the fence.
Okay.
I think that we have tools that allow us to do a better job. Our best tool is testing and data, and making sure that we emphasize for everybody the stuff that we already know. Masks work, ventilation works, vaccines work. Just go ahead, use them, get them, and get on with life.
I couldn't agree more, but when people hear it from you, they will trust it. And that is why it is so important to hear it from you. Dr. Gagandeep Kang, always an education to talk to you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to have you back on soon. Thank you very much. Take care. And to our audience, see you tomorrow. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalists.